Thank you, Rich. As mentioned, my name is Gary Brickhouse, and I'm the CISO at GuidePoint Security. And I'm here today to talk about operationalizing risk to strengthen cyber resilience. If you're wondering, yes, I did get paid extra for every additional syllable I worked into the title there. It's definitely a big one, but I think it really captures what we're trying to talk about today, which is taking risk and really using that to push forward our cyber resilience posture. As mentioned, I'm the CISO at GuidePoint Security. And just to give you a little glimpse of who we are, at the end of the day, we're your one stop shop for cybersecurity. That's really done through our strategic relationships with both you and our vendor community that's out there. We understand the solution landscape really well, in addition to just having a ton of internal expertise around it. So if you have any needs about information security at all, we are your one stop shop there. But let's jump into what we really mean by cyber resilience. You'll see a definition on your screen, and we're going to read through that here in just a minute. But I think the first stop is really to compare business resiliency versus cyber resiliency. These two terms oftentimes are used interchangeably, but they really do mean two totally different things. When we think about business resiliency, I mean, it's exactly what it says, and it really is the traditional meaning in and around resiliency, which is, hey, can the business continue to function and operate due to some sort of an outage? And that's wonderful and fantastic. But our focus here is really around cyber resilience. And so the definition that I have here is provided out of NIST 800-172. And you can see that it's a bit more broad than just sort of continuing on, right, of the business. It really is the ability to anticipate, withstand, recover from, and adapt to adverse conditions, stresses, attacks, or compromises on systems that use or are enabled by cyber resources. So, if we were to step back just for a second and we think about the industry at large, we really are evolving to more of resilience driven operations. I mean, that really is at the core more and more these days around how we're building out our systems. And so we see here from a cyber resilience standpoint, again, this ability to, get out ahead of what's happening. And if it does happen, right, we can withstand. But even then, if it does happen, we can recover from and put ourselves into really the best position possible to recover. So what I want to focus on today, though, really is just we don't have time, unfortunately, to unpack all of cyber resilience and as it relates to risk within that. But I wanted to focus just on these two words here around anticipate and withstand. And so, what does it look like to, again, improve or strengthen our cyber resilience posture specifically around anticipating and withstanding these adverse conditions or attacks? But before we jump into that, I think we should just spend a couple of minutes talking about why resilience matters. So why does it matter? A couple thoughts here, right? First, the attack surface that our threat actors are going after, it continues to expand. I'm not going to read all of these statistics, but when you look across the landscape of SaaS, of cloud, of APIs, of AI, it is a never-ending, expanding attack surface. And so, from a resiliency standpoint, and knowing what threat actors are targeting, it's important that we keep up with the growth that we see here. So again, some of these statistics, right? I mean, the ones that scare me the most, I feel like this 55% of employees who are adopting SaaS without security involvement. It's just so easy for that to happen. The On the API side, right, 56% report concerns about overprivileged API access, right? How is that being monitored and how is that being configured, and is there drift? Just so many things that cause concern there. From an AI perspective, this statistic here, around 24% of Gen AI projects are secured. What about the other 76%, right? So again, we feel like that the pace of the business is moving so fast, and technology is enabling them to do that, which in one hand is a great thing, but on the other, again, it's really expanding this attack surface in areas where we don't have visibility. It isn't the point of this talk, but if you move on to the next, sort of part of this, the other thing we see happen is just this tool expansion that's happening to keep up with this. I like to joke, it's all the SPMs, right? That exist out there to help keep up with this. It just creates tool sprawl and just makes it even more of a challenge for us. So what does this expanding attack surface leads to? It leads to ransomware growth. So GuidePoint, our threat intelligence team, Grit, they put out a quarterly ransomware report, and some of the recent statistics that you see here. 2025 Q1 of this year had a historic high for the most ransomware victims. Q1 of this year. We saw also earlier this year a 58% year over year increase from this time last year of ransomware groups that are out there, working to do bad things. Similarly, right, we see a 41% year over year increase this year over the vulnerabilities that exist out there, and a 75% increase in those flaws that have been actively exploited. So again, through a variety of reasons, and oh, by the way, we haven't even talked about phishing, and again, these other areas. The reality is, right, the bad guys are continuing to do more, right? Ransomware is continuing to grow and be a burden. So where does that sort of leave us, right? So the next part, we talk about, hey, here's our threat attack surface growing. Here's what the bad guys are doing. We also, from a resiliency perspective, it matters because the boards and executives have expectations. What got their attention? Oh, shocking, right? It's the money. So if you look at some of the impacts that some ransomware events have had, even just this year, as a matter of fact. So you see, Ingram Micro was, I think, the most recent. They estimated lost $136 million per day in lost sales. Marks and Spencer (M&S) estimated $403 million in lost operating profit. And then United Natural Foods, again, $350 to $400 million estimated loss in net sales. These numbers are staggering when you think about its impact on an organization. Not only that, it is certainly gets the attention of the board. I feel like earlier in my career, and I've been in the industry quite some time, and earlier in my career, I felt like the focus as it related to operational outages, it was just that. There might have been some sort of an outage that, hey, as long as we could recover pretty quickly, like that was okay. And it felt like, tape backups or, whatever else we had to do. But those things seem to sort of isolate themselves kind of within the business of IT largely. That just isn't the case anymore now with data exfiltration. What we see happening sort of across that landscape, you know, and just the more criticality that we have seen on, again, cloud and SaaS based operations. It's devastating when organizations are out of business and can't continue to produce revenue and generate income. Again, easily getting the board's attention very quickly. So their expectations are higher for some ability to have cyber resiliency. The other that we see is regulatory mandates. So again, we're not going to unpack all of these, but when you look at things like the SEC, when you look at the New York Department of Financial Services, what we have seen in HIPAA for a long time, right? There is this expectation of boards, of executives to have visibility and oversight for what's happening in their environment. If you take it sort of a step further as it relates to the SEC rule, right now, they actually have to disclose material cybersecurity incidents. Well, what happens when those get disclosed, right? Depending on the severity and what it is, there's a real risk that it could impact stock. And again, ultimately have an impact on the valuation of the organization. All things that get boards' attention and that, frankly, none of them want to have to deal with. And so, because of that, again, we see this elevated nature of trying to pay attention to cyber resiliency and ultimately an organization's capability to holistically sort of defend against and recover from threat actors. So if we were to transition back here for a second, we've set the stage a little bit in terms of, what are we talking about with cyber resiliency? And we've talked about why it matters. What I wanted to focus on here is really just some of the challenges that we see. And again, for sake of time, we're really just sort of narrowing our focus and being very specific about where we're going to put our attention to today. And honestly, it's really just around vulnerability management. So again, there's so much that we could unpack in and around cyber resiliency in a lot of different areas when we think about like defense in depth, for instance. But I think for the case of today, let's talk about vulnerability management. So we see some challenges that exist that sort of erode our ability to be cyber resilient. And as it relates to vulnerability management, some of the bullet points that you see here, the reality is that the traditional models are just struggling to keep pace. If you look at how fast we spoke of that a little bit earlier, how fast the technology is evolving and how quickly the business has access to things like cloud and SaaS and DevOps, right? It's moving forward so fast that we see these traditional models that are just harder is struggling to keep up with the pace of that attack surface and the vulnerabilities that exist there. The other thing that I think is important, I think sometimes there's this misnomer that as long as I'm like working really hard to, patch and address vulnerabilities, then I'm okay. The reality is, unfortunately, that doesn't equate, right? The effort that you may put into your patch management program may not equal any sort of resilience at all. Patching just for the sake of, accumulating some numerical number of systems that are patched, while helpful, may not be, and we'll talk about it certainly, right? The right systems to patch, right? They may not be your most critical ones. And so, what does it, look like to sort of, move some of that effort and to ensure that it's being done against those systems that have the most impact to our organization? We talked about this earlier as well, like around tool sprawl. Like the more SPMs of the world that go in place, or the more systems that we have, alerting and monitoring into, it's creating more noise. And so when you think about, and it's good noise, right? Like it's good in the sense that it's identifying things, but just from a practitioner perspective or from an operator perspective, that's so much more data now to have to go through to find again, it's raising the overall volume, but it's also from our ability to focus in and narrow in on the things that are important. It just creates a lot more noise. And the other thing that the tool sprawl sort of brings us also is this, fragmented visibility across a lot of different environments. Some of that's coming from tools that we use from a security solutions perspective, but even just again, when we talk about cloud and SaaS and DevOps and others, like we have just these chunks of data coming in from a variety of places that may not have sort of this holistic interlocking that we would like to see, right? That just gives us better visibility sort of across the board. And then finally, the thing here is, I think it might be my favorite, siloed remediation. I think if you were to joke about vulnerability management overall, it's this vision of, you have a security team that is identifying vulnerabilities and just sort of, throwing them across the proverbial wall over to, say, like a server engineering team, for instance, to go do patching. It's often hard, right, to follow back up and make sure it got patched. If there were questions, we run into issues like false positives, right? All sorts of things happen that really it's a little bit of a vacuum, right, where we see some of these things happen. So I think my challenge to you here is we're thinking about, hey, how do we sort of address these challenges more holistically? What I would like to really suggest and what we're going to talk about here, again, I think there's things that we could talk through and focus in on in addition, like specifically around addressing like vulnerability management specifically. But I think what would be more helpful is if we look forward a bit into ways that we can strengthen our cyber resiliency here, and ultimately, we're going to look at what I would, just going to consider as sort of supporting pillars of cyber resilience, but specifically in the vulnerability management space. And how are we going to sort of address these? So the two things that I think we would like to look at today is around continuous threat exposure management, or CTEM, and risk operations center. Unfortunately, as you can probably imagine, I don't have time to fully unpack either one of these. Uh, but I think at a minimum, what I hope to accomplish is really highlight the concepts and benefits of each of these so that ultimately you can consider those as you're thinking about how to address vulnerability management challenges and ultimately strengthen your overall resilience posture. So let's look for a minute at CTEM, continuous threat exposure management. So that's something that was coined by Gartner, really to address this, sort of larger challenge. Some of the things that we just looked at was the very reason why CTEM sort of is in place. And by the way, for those of you out there, I don't know where you're at as it relates to your knowledge on CTEM. I do know that GuidePoint, we recently did a webinar, and of those attendees, we did, sort of polled the audience, and about 50% noted that they were just in the beginning stages of learning about CTEM, and another 35% were really just starting to explore how it fit into their VM program. So I think in some ways, like just even a high level talk about CTEM here might be helpful for many of you. But I think, obviously when it's literally in the name when you think about CTEM is continuous. So if we think about vulnerability management in its traditional sense, it is a little more point in time, whereas CTEM has this essence of continuous, and it's adaptive as well, right? So and able to keep pace with the dynamic environments that we see, right, between cloud, SaaS, and DevOps and others. It's built with the ability to sort of accommodate that more continuous and adaptive scanning so that it can stay out ahead of what we see coming. The other part it allows for a broader attack surface scope. So, traditionally we think about vulnerability management that might be a little more limited to, servers and endpoints and other things like that. Whereas here within CTEM, right, we're opening up to cloud and SaaS and APIs and identity and misconfigurations and shadow IT and, all these things which we would more consider sort of that modern attack surface. One of the other pieces here that we see as well around CTEM is this risk validation effort. Again, some of the feedback that I think if any of your practitioners have heard is, we provide these vulnerabilities and patches that need to happen that really haven't even been validated. And I think you all know this. Like if you want to burn a system server operator relationship really fast, start giving them more and more give them more and more false positives. I mean, that they only have so much time to spend towards this, and if you're giving them false positive, it's not a good thing. So the fact that what we see within the CTEM model is a validation step is fantastic. Then I think, again, there's even some level of business risk alignment that we see, again, which is this sort of focusing on prioritizing around those systems that might have a higher business impact. And what you see, and again, we're obviously not going in order here, but as it relates to this first step around scoping, I mean, that really helps you define those business functions that might be more critical that you might want to elevate in terms of a prioritization to what you're going to do from a patching perspective. So I think that business risk alignment is a big piece of that. And then finally, what we'll talk about here is really just around end-to-end life cycle. The whole point of this, as you can see, is this sort of never-ending circle of going all the way from identifying and prioritizing and patching, but or validation, and then making sure that it's being handed off to the right teams with the feedback loop, right, to ultimately ensure that work's done. So it isn't just, hey, I found the vulnerabilities and I've thrown them over the wall and the process stops. When we think about CTEM, it really goes into that full action step to say, hey, we're going to make sure that it's assigned and that work is done and complete as we expected. That is unfortunately probably like a 4-minute primer on CTEM, but I think it's important that you understand how it addresses many of the challenges that we see today in traditional vulnerability management. The other thing I wanted to touch on here as well, this sort of second pillar of some sorts, is really Risk Operations Center, which is certainly a much newer category for us to be thinking about. And honestly, this graph that I put together probably doesn't do it justice. I think if you were to go look, obviously there's a lot of work that Qualys is putting into this right now. And so I think you can see much better visual representations of what's here. But I think in its simplicity, it really communicates what we see happening across a risk operations center. And, without going through all of it right this second, what I would want you to see and know when we think about a risk operations center is it really is this sort of convergence between security risks that we're used to seeing and that we're used to talking about, but also business risk, right? And so it really is this convergence of these two areas so that it isn't just one more system or one more dashboard for you to look at. I think the goal really is to create this aggregated view between what we see from a security and technical perspective, but also that business perspective and business context as well. So there's a few things that you see in here that feed into the rock. So from the right of the screen, moving left, right? We just talked about CTEM, and so when you think about vulnerability sort of management, when you look at like those sort of identified, validated findings, right? I mean, again, that's sort of what we get out of CTEM, right? That feeds into it, but we also layer on these other components, right? That give us a more wholesome picture. From a threat intelligence perspective, right, being able to feed in that sort of data, risk quantification. So if you think about, again, that's a topic for another day, but it's our ability to quantify financially what the risk burden is if a particular risk materializes. So I can know that, hey, if I were to have a ransomware system that impacts my reservation system, right, our risk quantification around that might be $7 million. Right. Well, that's fantastic. If you don't think that your CFO or your CEO or your board resonate with actual dollars, right? I mean, that's the whole point of risk quantification. And then what I would say is there's even additional business context that can be applied here as well. Looking at like systems that tie into revenue or supply chain compliance pieces, right? All provide this additional business context that when you take all of that and sort of pour it into a risk operations center, you get these outcomes. And again, these are just a few of the outcomes, but I think they're all worth noting around just this business aligned risk management, right? I think in a nutshell, right, that's really what we're trying to accomplish here is we want to know what the risks are, but we need to understand them in the context of the business that's being done in a way, right? You see at the bottom here around executive alignment. I think it's being done in a way that communicates using the same language and the same terminology that can be shared with your CEO and your CFO and your CISO and your board, right? So that they can have a better understanding of what these risks are. And again, it's done in a way with this business context that provides just better visibility and more, I would say, consumable visibility of what that threat landscape ultimately looks like. I think it's fair to mention here too, from a Qualys perspective, again, I see them driving a lot as it relates to Risk Operations Center. They also are, sort of pushing forward with what they call mROC, which is a managed ROC, which is really a partner delivered model that's based and built on their True Risk platform. Again, getting ahead of ourselves a little bit in terms of how to operationalize it, but I think it's an example of what that looks like to be operationalized in an actual environment. So if you were to think about what we just looked at with CTEM, what we just looked at with a risk operations center, ultimately what we're trying to get to is this, right? Unified risk management. When you bring these two things together, what it enables us to do is take all these threads that we see happening in our environment, all these things, at least in this lens from a vulnerability management perspective, it marries these threads together to give us this visibility that we otherwise wouldn't have so that we can have some sort of a unified risk management approach. And especially when you factor in business context and talking with other business executives, that's really ultimately what we're after here. I'd be short-sighted if I didn't mention, when we think about unified risk management, there are other feeders outside of just vulnerability management that can feed into this. But again, I think that's really what we're trying to tackle here. I would say holistically for organizations, but definitely as it relates to what we just talked about with the Risk Operations Center and CTEM as well, unified risk management. So in closing, I would just want to give you a couple of key takeaways as we think about what does it mean to strengthen your cyber resilience, specifically around these components of our ability to anticipate and our ability to withstand. So first, we have to adapt, right, and bring modern approaches to keep up with modern attack surfaces. As the technology continues to grow, as it continues to move faster, we have to adapt our processes and approaches to get there. Secondly, risk-based prioritization is a key and necessary to provide the focus that we need so that the efforts that we spend are relevant, that they're valuable, that they're meaningful, that they really are lowering our risk profile and making sure that our most critical assets are the ones that's protected. We don't care as much about volume, although some could argue the quality is in the quantity, right? But we want to make sure that we're our risk, our highest risk, our most critical assets are being addressed at the beginning. And then finally, I would just encourage you to adopt a CTEM or a ROC mindset to drive towards this vision of unified risk management. I think when you really think about, again, what are we trying to accomplish by addressing risk, by bringing together these threads of again, visibility that tell us things about our attack surface, that help us identify where our threat actors are targeting. Again, that just simplifies it and makes life better for all of us security practitioners. So that said, thank you. Thanks for the time to just talk a little bit about overall strengthening our cyber resilience posture. If you'd love any more information about CTEM or ROC, please reach out, hit us up at info@gpsec.com. Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a great day.